Today we're looking at Russia and Japan in the modern era. And Russia and Japan were kind of at a similar crossroads to the Ottoman Empire in China. And that crossroads was the growing power of Europe. And when met with the challenges that this brought with it, Russia and Japan were more successful at implementing the needed change and industrializing and modernizing. So we're going to start by looking at Russia. And so at the beginning of this era, Russia was extremely conservative, and they had tried to block a lot of the more liberal changes and the liberal ideas that were seeping in from Western Europe. They had tried to stop a lot of the Enlightenment ideas. They had tried to stop the ideas of the French Revolution from seeping into Russia. And so overall, they were still very conservative. And the Decembrist uprising, this was an uprising amongst army officers, especially kind of middle-level army officers, who wanted some Western-style reforms. And ultimately, this Decembrist uprising is going to be put down by the Tsar, and it's going to lead to Russia becoming even more conservative. The big turning point for Russia was the Crimean War. The Crimean War, Russia had tried to take over more territory that belonged to the Ottoman Empire. However, this time, Europe steps in because they didn't want Russia gaining all of that territory and upsetting their balance of power. And so Europe steps in and defeats Russia. And so this kind of showed Russia that, hey, we need to modernize, we need to update our military, and more importantly, we needed to industrialize. And so the Crimean War is going to be kind of that turning point in Russia, and kind of causes them to begin to industrialize and modernize. So one of the big things that was still holding Russia back was serfdom. And in order to industrialize, serfdom doesn't work well. And so you need a large supply of workers. And serfdom simply wasn't efficient enough to provide the labor to industrialize. And so that's going to lead to the emancipation of the serfs. And the emancipation of the serfs was overseen by the Tsar Alexander II. And basically, he said it was better that the emancipation took place from the top down instead of them demanding it, him giving it to the serfs. He knew if he didn't free the serfs, eventually they would rebel. And so serfs gained the right to own land, and they got quite a bit of land from the nobility. However, the nobles kept the best of the lands for themselves, and the leftovers were kind of given to the former serfs. And even though the serfs gained their freedom, they didn't have any political power, and they had to pay back a redemption tax on the land that they received. And so many of them remained in debt and were forced to stay on the villages that they'd always been on until that debt was paid. And so they did gain their freedom, but not a lot changed in their daily lives. And the Tsar, meanwhile, was very careful to keep the aristocratic order in place. And so following the emancipation of the serfs, we are going to see some minor political and legal reforms that followed. The creation of the Zemstvos. These were local assemblies with representatives from all the different classes, and they could oversee kind of local affairs. And so they might work on improving roads, or they might improve the school system, the local school systems. However, they can only really deal with local issues, and they had no influence on the larger political issues. They also created some new law codes, but overall, these reforms were very minor and didn't really bring in the needed change that Russia needed. Meanwhile, Russia is going to be pretty successful at industrializing, and a lot of this is going to center on the railroads. The creation of the Trans-Siberian Railroad and the expansion of railroads in general is going to fuel industrialization in Russia. And so they were part of this kind of second phase of the Industrial Revolution. And a lot of the money needed either came from foreign investments or came from exporting of raw materials. Russia begins to export large amounts of oil and grains as well. And they focus on the heavy industries, the coal and steel industries. A key difference, though, between industrialization in Russia and industrialization in Western Europe was industrialization was controlled from the top down. It wasn't as capitalistic as what we saw take place over in Europe. Instead, this was kind of forced upon people by the government. And so a key figure in the industrialization of Russia was Sergei Witte. He was a minister of finance, and he was a big supporter of industrialization and really focused first on the railroads, because the railroads helped kind of draw the empire together. And so within a very short amount of time, Russia's railroads are going to expand across their nation. They're going to go from only having about 700 miles of railroads in 1860, and by 1900, over 36,000 miles of railroads. And again, that's going to fuel many other industries. It's going to fuel their own iron industry. And by 1900, Russia was producing half of the world's oil. They were second only to the United States in oil production, and large amounts of iron as well, the fourth most iron production in all of the world. So overall, Russia was pretty successful at industrializing, but again, it happened from the top down.